This screencast is for Chapter 1, Section 1. Chapter 1 is Colliding Worlds. It'll take us from 1450 all the way through 1600. And Section 1 is the Native American experience. Okay, so the first Americans. The first people to live in the Western Hemisphere were part of like a small band of tribal migrants from Asia. We believe that they were following animal herds across a land bridge that connected Alaska and Siberia, and you can see that in the picture here. Here's Alaska, and Siberia is actually the northern and eastern part of Russia. And so we believe that the original migrants to the Americas were chasing game across this land bridge that used to connect the two continents. Most of those migrations probably occurred at the end of the Ice Age. So when the glacier above this land bridge melted, the bridge was then covered in water, and it's now known as the Bering Strait. So for about 300 generations, the people in America were geographically isolated from the people on other continents. What that means for them is that they were completely unaware that there were any people in Europe or Africa, or that those places even existed. So they start to develop their own empires in America. So we're going to take a look at a few of those under American empires. And we're going to start with Mesoamerica. When the Europeans arrived in America eventually, most natives at that time, there were about 40 million of them at that time, they lived in an area known as Mesoamerica. So the majority of natives lived in Mesoamerica when the Europeans got here. Mesoamerica is made up of both Mexico and Guatemala, which is part of Central America, and you can see that on the map here. So that's where about 40 million of the first Americans were living. The rest were living in areas north of Mesoamerica, but there were only about 15 million in those areas. So the majority, 40 million, were living in Mesoamerica. One of those groups were the Mayas. They lived on the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. And they also lived in the rainforests in Guatemala. The Mayas were a very structured society. They had an elite class that ruled and lived in luxury. But they also had a peasant class. And that peasant class provided the elite with money through high taxes. The Mayas also developed a system of hieroglyphic writing and a calendar. And they were able to record historical events and royal lineages because of that. So they had not just the system of writing, but they have the calendar. And so because they had those things, they could record historical events and royal lineages. These are just a couple of examples of Mayan civilizations on the Yucatan. These are really big tourist destinations now. If you visit around the Cancun or Playa del Carmen, or even Cozumel, the island off the coast of Mexico, if you visit any of those areas, you're likely to be offered like an excursion to Tulum, which is the one on the coast, or Chichen Itza, which is a little bit more inland. But these are just some some of the Mayan civilizations that are still standing today that you can go and tour. Okay, the other large group of natives in Mesoamerica were the Aztecs. The Aztecs established a highly powerful empire in Mesoamerica. Their capital city was known as Tenochtitlan, and it's now known as Mexico City, but back then it was Tenochtitlan. It served as the center of an expansive and well-regulated tribute, agriculture, and trade network. So it might not have been called the capital city back then, but that's basically what it served as. The Aztecs established a hierarchical social order. Basically what that means is that they rank one social class above another. At the very top of their hierarchy were priests and warrior nobles. This group subdued most of the people of central Mexico, and they sacrificed captured enemies to the gods. And they did that because they believed that the gods influenced life and farming cycles. So anytime they would capture an enemy, they would sacrifice, human sacrifice to the gods. Below the priest and warrior nobles were the free Aztec commoners. The commoners were mostly farmers, and they farmed on communally owned land, which basically means that they all owned the land together and they worked together on those farms. There wasn't really any individually owned property. And then at the very bottom of that social hierarchy were the slaves and serfs. And they were often used by the nobles for free labor or other things. Okay, so that was Mesoamerica. In the land above Mesoamerica, a little farther to the north, when you're getting more so into modern-day United States and Canada, you're going to see a bunch of different native tribes and a bunch of different types of civilizations. Mostly what you're going to find here are chiefdoms and confederacies. I'm going to give you a few examples of those, and the first one is the Mississippi Valley. The native civilizations in North America did not grow to the size of the Aztec and the empires, and the Mayans and some of the other empires in Mesoamerica. But they did adopt an agriculture based on maize, which is basically like corn. And because they adopted that, it contributed to an increase in their urbanization, which means they kind of had like a city-like atmosphere. Urban means city. So it contributed to an increase in urbanization and a more sophisticated social structure by AD 1000. In the Mississippi Valley, the city of Cahokia had an impressive population of over 10,000. And it pretty much developed into the administrative and religious center of the region. The entire region had about 30,000 inhabitants, and so 10,000 of those in the region lived in Cahokia. They were also the Mississippi Valley native groups were also really well known for creating mounds. You can see an example of that in the picture on the screen. They had about 120 mounds in the area, and they could function as burial grounds or bases for ceremonial buildings, or it could even be a base for a ruler's home. Right, another example are the eastern woodlands. This incorporates a very large area, as you can see on the map, and I put a whole list of different tribes that belong to this region on the screen. There were several distinct societies, including the two big ones in this area would be the Algonquian and the Iroquois. They were mostly located in the north, and they shared several language and lifestyle traits. Most of the people in the eastern woodlands, they lived in semi-permanent villages where women formed. They formed fields, typically of maize, beans, and squash. Those were their big crops. And they also gathered additional food items. They participated in community affairs, while the men typically were the ones who would go to war. They hunted and they fished. The political system among the peoples of the eastern woodlands varied widely. Some were chiefdoms, which means there's a single ruler and he held all the power. Others had adopted a paramount chiefdom, in which one chief emerged as the ruler over several subordinate chiefs and their respective communities. And then others maintained an independent and locally limited political leadership structure. All right, in the area of the Great Lakes, you have a lot of the Algonquian speakers. They were highly mobile, and their lives were based on hunting, fishing, and traveling. They basically would go where the food went. So if they were hunting buffalo and the buffalo moved farther west, then the tribe would move farther west. So highly mobile. And because of this, it helped them to develop trade relationships with other tribes, and it helped them to shape military alliances as well. All right, farther west, you had the Great Plains and the Rockies. The arrival of the horse in this area, this was actually an escaped European import. Horses are not native to America. They came over from Europe. And so with the arrival of the horse, everything changed in the Great Plains and the Rockies. The cultures and the geopolitics of the indigenous people were permanently changed. Even before they personally encountered Europeans, just because horses had come over, it had permanently changed their way of life. Just one example of this, the Comanches became very impressive hunters, skilled raiders, and fierce warriors. And they were able to greatly expand their territory, and that's all because of the horse. The peoples of the Sioux Nation, that's the second one on the list there, Sioux. The peoples of the Sioux Nation expanded their domain westward into the Black Hills, and the Crow Indians became successful bison hunters. They also became expert horse breeders and really, really good at trading. And again, that's all because of the introduction of the horse. But despite this increased mobility of hunter-gatherer civilizations, several native peoples still maintained agricultural settlements. So you had a few that were hunters and gatherers and they chased the food, but others still had permanent to semi-permanent villages where they relied mostly on agriculture. All right, even farther west in the arid southwest were a group of natives known as the Pueblos. And the Pueblos developed an agricultural settlement by AD 600. They used irrigation to grow crops by AD 1000. And they lived in these very distinct multi-room structures that were known as pueblos. And they were typically carved into steep cliffs, like the one that you can see in the picture there. That's an example of the pueblo. And so the people became known as the pueblos based on the structures that they lived in. So their houses and the people were both called pueblos. On the Pacific coast, you had a multitude of distinct hunter-gatherer groups. They lived on the Pacific coast along the ocean. And they lived mostly in independent and socially stratified communities, hunting game. They also gathered seeds and nuts and fish. And one example is the Chinooks. They were easily distinguished because they were the ones, if you think of the natives and you think totem poles, that came from the Chinooks. They were easily distinguished through their colorful totem poles. They emerged as one of the most powerful nations of the Pacific Northwest. Okay, that wraps up Chapter 1, Section 1. If you have any questions about the information in this screencast or you need anything clarified, please email me.